Hello Year 7. We're now going to look at what England was like during the Middle Ages. So not immediately after the conquest of Britain by the Normans, but further along. So our title today and our key question is, what was England like during the Middle Ages? The overview for this question tells us that far from their dour reputation, the Middle Ages were a period of massive social change. Burgeoning nationalism, international conflict, terrible natural disaster, climate change, rebellion, resistance and renaissance. So I'm just going to go over that again for you because some of those words are a little bit sort of difficult. So dour means gloomy. So we tend to sometimes present the Middle Ages as dark, gloomy, miserable times. But things were changing. Society was changing. People were becoming very nationalistic. They were very proud of their country. There was a lot of wars abroad, hence the international conflict. In Britain at that time, there was terrible natural disasters, so there was a lot of drought, climate change, and rebellion, resistance, and renaissance, so things were changing. When we study medieval history, we tend to lump it into big events, things like the death of Thomas Becket and the power of the Catholic Church, the Crusades, wars with France, the Black Death and the revolts by both the barons and the peasants. But there was also a lot of really small gradual changes, things that took ages and ages to come into effect. For example, the English language started to dominate England, and feudalism, the way society was made up, broke down slowly. So things were changing and things were improving. Some things got worse, obviously, but Britain and life in Middle Ages was changing. So we're now going to have a look at this source. Okay, and if you look at the provenance at the bottom underneath the image, it tells us that it's called the peasants were preparing the fields for winter with a harrow and sowing the grain from the very rich hours of the Duke of Berry around the year 1410. Okay, so again, you should be used to doing this now. What is this source informing and suggesting to us about life in the Middle Ages? And again, there's a hint there. Enlarge the picture, make it bigger. Look at the really tiny details in the background. So it's not just a castle. What is going on there? For example, what is the man doing in the next field over? What do you think he's up to? Who do you think are the people gathered at the doorway of the castle? Why might they be there? So like before, divide the space up into two and write down all the things you can see, all the facts, and all the things that it suggests, what it makes you think about. If you're unsure of what you're looking at, like in the provenance it says a harrow, have a look on the internet, find out what it means, or use a dictionary, find out what a harrow is. Okay, the empathy task now is the imagine task. So it's 1381. That's the year I want you to imagine it is. Excuse me. England is still recovering from the devastating effects of the Black Death. There is a shortage of workers and a very young king. He's only 14 years old. People are being heavily taxed and can barely afford to live. Now you hear that there is a man called Wat Tyler, and he's gathering a group of people to march on London and protest against the king, King Richard II. Now at that time, going against your king, who was divinely appointed, meant that you were going against God himself. But your family are poor and starving because of the king and his taxes. So, do you join the peasants' revolt? Do you side with Wat Tyler, or do you just stay at home and let everybody else sort it out? I want you to think carefully about that and think about why there was a shortage of people. Why were people going against the king? What does having too many taxes mean to your income? So therefore I want you to write a letter to your friend, and I want you to either encourage them to join or, on the opposite side, persuade them to stay in Kent and keep out of trouble. So in your letter, make sure that you think about it carefully and make sure you give some reasons of why they should join in and what the outcome might be. Or if you're going to say that they should stay in Kent, give me some good reasons why they should stay. What would be the point of staying there? Now the questions section. So what 3 important questions would you have for people at that time? Okay, so it could be using the source, looking at that and asking questions about the castle or the sewing and the work a peasant does. It could be about the peasants' revolt and what Tyler was. It's entirely up to you which 3 questions you choose. But remember, you're only going to have the 3 to ask. And finally, the really, really good part. We would like you to go to click the link there and go and watch Dan Snow's Filthy Cities. It shows some of the jobs in the houses and the lives of people living in medieval London. It also shows you why the Black Death was able to spread through the city so quickly, and his documentaries on the many amazing castles that were built during this time. You could also research the Battle of Sandwich, the story of what happened when King John tried to go back on the Magna Carta and another French ruler tried to take the English crown. So there's always lots of other things you can do to help you fill in the gaps, widen your knowledge.
Hello Year 7, today's lesson is what was England like during the Middle Ages? Now this is something that you studied this year, but it's really important that you understand this to make sure we have a good springboard for the lessons for next year. So, the question today is asking you, what was England, the place, like during the Middle Ages? This is the medieval era, okay? We're going to look at what society was like, what the culture was like, and what the people were like. So what sort of jobs they have, what do they believe in, who's in charge, who has any power, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is read through the overview. I'll read it to you and I'll explain any words or concepts you might not understand. You might want to read the overview again later on once you're doing some of the tasks, just to make sure you're really clear on what's happening. So, the majority of people living during the Middle Ages lived in the countryside and worked as farmers. Usually there was a local lord who lived in a large house called a manor or a castle. It's kind of a little bit like the feudal system that William I brought into England, and then it sort of continued throughout the Middle Ages. Local peasants would work the land of the lord. The peasants were called lords' villeins, which was like a servant. City life was very different from the country life, but it wasn't much easier. The cities were crowded and dirty. A lot of people worked as craftsmen and were a member of a guild. A guild is like a community, a group of people or a town with similar interests. Young boys would serve as apprentices for 7 years learning a craft. Other jobs in the city included servants, merchants, bakers, doctors and lawyers. A merchant is someone that sells and buys goods and trades them. Although we often picture large castles when we think of the Middle Ages, most people lived in a small 1 or 2 room home. These homes were very crowded and usually everyone slept in the same room. In the countryside, the family may also live with the animals and livestock in the home. This might be for certain reasons, like not wanting them to be stolen or weather conditions. The home was usually dark and smoky from a fire. The fire would normally be in the middle of the room and would probably be used for heat and cooking. It wasn't always easy to ensure the fumes and the smoke left the house. These dirty conditions did not help in 1348 when the Black Death came to England through trade routes from China. Over a third of Europe's population died from the disease. It got the name the Black Death from the very dark, smelly buboes people would get. So the Black Death came to England in 1348, and it was really contagious. But because people didn't understand so much about hygiene as we did nowadays, it was made even worse. Now, they didn't even know what was causing the disease. They were very superstitious and thought that God maybe had caused it as a punishment, or that the Jews had caused it, or the alignment of the planets. There are many reasons, but they didn't actually understand it was the fleas that were travelling on rats from China and the trade routes. People were very religious during the Middle Ages. The church was often at the heart of the town and the village. The afterlife was something that people were scared of, and they would do everything they could on their life on earth to ensure they can get into heaven. Now remember, we were talking about this in lessons. There's good things that people might do. They'll go to church and pray. If they'd committed any sins, they'd make sure they apologise for those and ask for forgiveness. We also have things that people would do that maybe we would kind of frown upon a little bit. Things like indulgences. Remember, people could pay for almost like a fast pass through purgatory. Now, if you had to pay for these things, it would mainly be the rich that could afford it and not the poor. We also talked about another method of payment to the church to help. There was a special tax where people would pay about 10% of their wages, the money they earned, to the church. This was called a tithe. Now, if you did things like this, it suggested that you were very religious and that you were a good person, in hopes that you would then go to heaven. So, the first task you need to do is look at this source. This is a doom painting from Cowden Church during the Middle Ages. Many paintings like this were really popular in churches at the time, and maybe we need to think about why they would be in a church. So, look at this image. What does it inform you about life in the Middle Ages? What is it telling you about people? What places might they be going to? What might they see? Then what does this suggest? What can you see in this painting? What is it suggesting might happen to you? Now you've done your source analysis task, let's move on to the imagine task. You need to imagine that you're a farmer from the Middle Ages. Write a diary entry explaining what your life is like. You could include your daily routine, your family, and your religious views. So you might want to explain to me what you are growing, how your life farming is. Is it easy? Is it difficult? What's your house like that's on your farm? Describe it to me. What can you smell? What can you see? What can you hear? You then might want to explain your religious views. How do you feel about God? Why do you feel that way? Now imagine you've got a time machine and you could go back and ask 3 questions to someone in this time period. What questions would you ask them? Would you ask them about their family life? Would you ask them about their social life? Would you ask them about their diet or their religion? Think of some really specific questions you can ask them. Your final task of this lesson is to go and find out more. Research the jobs and houses of the Middle Ages. Create a town map showing what the homes were like and what buildings they would have had in the town. You could then research the Black Death. What did people of the Middle Ages think cures and treatments were? So how would they treat this disease? Is there any weird treatments you can find? You then might want to watch Disney's Robin Hood. This film is about King John, who reigned from 1199 to 1216. What was he like? What hardships did the ordinary people have at the time? So what struggles did people have? Or you might want to watch Robin Hood, the Prince of Thieves, which will tell you a lot about feudalism and the life of peasants. Once you've done this, you've completed today's lesson. Well done, Year 7.
Last lesson, we were looking at what Britain was like in the Middle Ages. This lesson, we're going to extend that by looking at what Europe was like during the Renaissance and the change in continuity between the two time periods. The Renaissance followed the Middle Ages and lasted from the 1300s until the 1600s. Renaissance is a French term for rebirth. The era was given this name as it was a time of great change for culture, art, politics, so how countries were run and the laws that were passed, and economics, so how people made their money, how it changed hands, and how it was taxed. We use this term rebirth to mean born again. So societies were looking at how they were doing things and reimagined how they could be done. In some cases, they rediscovered old techniques from the Romans. Sometimes inventions were brought over from other continents through trade and warfare, and in other cases, scientific research meant that new technology and understanding changed the way Europeans viewed and interacted with the world. All this meant that a lot of changes were sweeping through Europe at this time. One of these changes came from Italy, the idea of humanism. This idea was that man was the centre of his own universe and people should celebrate human achievements. Last lesson we looked at the importance of the church and of God. Due to the new idea of humanism, there was some conflict of beliefs over the importance of man and the importance of God. There were many inventions that were developed during the Renaissance, but the printing press was arguably the most important. The printing press was invented by a man named Gutenberg in the 1400s. It was a new way of printing books. This meant that books could be made quicker, cheaper, and a lot more people had access to them. The access to books meant that ideas and knowledge could be shared easily across Europe, and popular books were often printed in lots of languages, including the Bible, meaning that for the first time many people had direct access to the Word of God. Previously it had only been in Latin, and people had to rely on the church, on priests, to translate it for them. But now people could read the Word of God in their own homes. This again caused conflict. But the printing press was also important because people were printing about other ideas, such as the way the human body worked. Up until the Renaissance, bodies had always been drawn in 2D, very flat and with very little colour. This changed greatly due to the idea of humanism. Famous artists emerged painting bodies, often showing people naked and what the human body looked like, both inside and out. Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most famous artists from this time and did all sorts of drawings of the human body. One of his most famous paintings, the Mona Lisa, can still be seen at the Louvre in Paris, France. Not only was the body drawn to new levels of accuracy for reasons of art, it was also drawn for reasons for science too. Vesalius is a famous anatomist. That's someone who studies the human body. He would dissect bodies and then record his findings. Previously, the church controlled what people knew about the body, choosing to promote the ideas of two men from ancient times. Vesalius, however, was able to show what the body really looked like and able to correct some of the misconceptions from the past. Not only did communication, art, and knowledge of the body change drastically during the Renaissance, religion did too. I've spoken about how conflict arose between these new ideas and the church. This is because the Christian church at this time was all one Catholic faith. Catholic means united, and they were united because until this point everyone believed in the power of the Pope based in Rome, Italy. This meant that the church had enormous power. However, during the Renaissance, because of the ability to share ideas so quickly and so cheaply, the church started losing some of its power and came under threat. One man that threatened the power of the church was Martin Luther, a German priest. He was very religious, but he didn't agree with how the Pope in Rome was running the church. Martin Luther and a group known as the Reformers started a split from the Catholic Church. A new church was created alongside the Catholic Church. It was named the Protestant Church because it was protesting the Catholics. It became increasingly popular throughout Europe. Henry VIII even had England convert to Protestantism in 1532. Have a look at this source. Because it's a source, we know it was created at the time of the Renaissance. It was painted by an artist called Raphael in the early 1500s. He called it the School of Athens. Why do you think he named it that? What does this suggest or imply about the Renaissance? We said that the Renaissance was a time of rebirth, of looking back at old civilizations. What in this painting suggests that to be true? What do we know about the Renaissance that we can see in this painting? You might want to have a closer look at the bottom left-hand corner for clues. What do you think the men are discussing in their groups? What do you think Raphael was telling us about the Renaissance with his painting? What do you think he was implying? Vesalius was a 16th century anatomist and physician, meaning he studied and treated the human body. He created one of the most famous and influential books at the time, called On the Fabric of the Human Body. As well as studying and treating the body, he also taught others how to at the University of Padua, as well as being the doctor to one of the great kings of Europe. Imagine you are him for the day. Write a diary entry describing everything you've done. You may want to talk about your job, your discoveries, and how you're going to pass on this new knowledge to other people. Try to include as many details and specifics as you can. It's the small details that make for great historical writing. The Renaissance was a time of great change and some amazing discoveries. What questions do you have for the people that lived at the time? If you enjoyed this lesson on the European Renaissance, you might want to do some more research. You can go on a virtual tour of the Louvre and see some of the amazing paintings, sculptures, and other artworks of the time. You may want to investigate the fashion, looking into how the way people dressed changed over time, the differences in what the peasants and poorer people wore to the clothes of the wealthy and the upper classes. There is also the Disney film, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It shows what it was like in 14th century Paris. You can see the hustle and bustle of the city, but it also investigates the power of the church. Remember, just because it's based on fiction doesn't mean that elements of it aren't real. For example, Notre Dame is a beautiful cathedral in the heart of Paris. While the roof of it burnt down last year, you can still see the grand structure if you visit the city of Paris today.